So Resident Evil Village came out a little over a week ago, as of the time I started writing this anyway, and since then I've played through it several times and have started my next playthrough. I said in my last video where I talked about the RE1 remake that I was planning to do a marathon leading up to a review of Resident Evil Village, and that's still the plan, but at the time I wrote that script I didn't realize that RE Village, was meant to be played multiple times because it wasn't out yet, and that combined with how many other Resident Evil videos I'm currently working on, I decided it would be a better idea to give my thoughts about Village now in regards to my experiences thus far, and then do a follow-up when I'm done powering through that Village of Shadows, boy. With that being said, what does Resident Evil Village bring to the franchise table, and how does it stack up as its own thing alongside other Resident Evils? Well, starting from the beginning, it opens up with an intro that's definitely unique in style and tone for the Resident Evil franchise. What follows is a sequence where the nice family and wife and home is taken away from Mr. Ethan Winters from the last game because we have a new video game we need to get to, and which propels us into a story where Chris Redfield takes our daughter, Rose, along with us to some unknown destination before there's a car accident. Ethan then wakes up in the snow and follows a path looking for his daughter, which leads to a village with a spooky castle laying off in the background. Soon after, Ethan is thrust into the middle of yet another nightmare scenario involving a twisted family who seek to torture him, except this time it's got a more fantastical twist, what with the vampire ladies, the metal bender, the Hunchback of Notre Dame, and who I'm pretty sure is the villain from the movie Dead Silence, all led by Mother Miranda, who in my mind just has to be a reference to the Fool's Idol boss from Demon Souls. I mean, there's just no way that's coincidental, especially since Resident Evil Village wears a lot of its influences on its sleeve. However, I think that's neither a bad thing, nor does this game do it badly by any means. Its biggest influence is easily Resident Evil 4. After playing this and comparing it to Resident Evil 7, I get a strong feeling that the team was really interested in taking the two big eras of Resident Evil, that being the classic and then the RE4 style, and doing it their own way. For Resident Evil 7, this was the old-school Resident Evil with the contained property and the confined areas with the strong survival classic horror elements, whereas Resident Evil Village takes up after Resident Evil 4's B-movie horror and gameplay. And when I say takes after, what I mean is that the game follows pretty much the same game philosophies and design, and in many ways they seem to set out with accomplishing the same goals. They both aim to be action horror titles with rewards for replaying the game multiple times, open-world game design where areas loop back on themselves and gradually open up the more you play, both revolving around a European village. They both aim to change up the pace and what you're doing moment to moment in gameplay while sticking to the same basic mechanics. They both encourage revisiting areas to explore and find hidden treasures, combining items to make bigger treasures that are worth more money. I know some of that has been done in other Resident Evil games since Resident Evil 4 came out 16 years ago, and my back hurt writing that sentence. But this is the first time since Resident Evil 4 that you can tell they were really aiming to recapture what made that the greatest game of all time. And don't fucking at me, I'm right and you know it. Resident Evil Village is more of a proper spiritual successor than Resident Evil 4's own sequel, which would be Resident Evil 5 if you're having trouble keeping up, ever was. For me personally, this has been pretty much exactly what I wanted, and it's actually become somewhat of a problem. I haven't gotten work done on several projects this past week because I've been spending my free time playing Resident Evil Village instead of working on my mixes or my weekly blog posts for my website or my videos or my laundry or this script. Seriously, I have sat down multiple times, written a few sentences, then convinced myself I need to play a bit more for research purposes, and then 3 days have passed and I still haven't written my fucking script. It didn't help that I got my second COVID shot last week and was down for the count for a few days. I mean, it helped me get a lot of RE Village played, but sort of just gave me an excuse to stay in bed and do nothing else. Obviously, this shows that both my discipline could use some work, and also that Resident Evil Village is the absolute diggity. I've heard in several reviews that people sort of feel like the game goes downhill following the first part in the castle with Lady Thick and her devil rejects wannabe daughters. And while I can understand that, I don't really agree with it. It is the only part of the game that feels traditional Resident Evil with the puzzles and the secret doors and the mansion setting and the tyrant-style character that's about a third as scary as the tyrant from that RE2 make. It's after this, though, that the game really starts to pick up steam for me. The more I play it, the more I find myself just powering through Mommy's Milky Castle so I can get to the part where the village opens up. Besides, after this section, we move along to the other three children, and things get interesting from there. If you've played this game, I'm sure you're familiar with that dollhouse. Now, I love this section of the game. And no spoilers in case you haven't played it or seen footage yet. In fact, if you are still completely blind, try and go in that way. Trust me, it's totally worth it. I will say, however, that this section of the game is a very clear homage to a certain playable trailer that was released back in 2014. A particular playable trailer that I can still play in its original form because I have it on my PS4 hard drive, and so going back to do that for this review, I can say it's even more of an homage than I originally thought. The basement section of the dollhouse is set up very similar to the house in PT. The furniture is similar, the wallpaper is similar, they do the creepy phone bit, the works. And not a lot of people are able to experience it these days, so a loving homage to something that we wish would have been was a really cool choice for changing up the pace during this section of the game. There are two big sequences in this game that are definitely straight out of Resident Evil 4. However, they aren't just copy-pasted versions of these events, they just take the certain ideas and do them in their own way. One of these sequences is at the beginning of the game, which I won't spoil, but there's this one section later on I do want to get into, so very minor spoiler warning now. Alright, so there's this section of RE Village that takes place in a reservoir involving a boss fight against a giant fish. Now, if you played Resident Evil 4, this will sound familiar to you as one of the things that happens early on in the game. However, after doing a little bait and switch for those RE4 fans, we find that this boss encounter is entirely different than the one in RE4 and actually does it much better. Not to put down Resident Evil 4, the greatest game of all time, in any way, shape, or form, but this reservoir sequence in Resident Evil Village is awesome. Has a little bit of everything, really. Some platforming, some puzzle solving, some combat, and I really enjoy overall how RE Village took this and changed it up. There's a part later on that I've heard some complaints about where the game takes a dip into that modern military shooter for about 15 minutes, and yeah, I'm not a big fan of it either. However, I don't hate it very much just because it sort of comes and goes, and I like Resident Evil Village enough that I'm willing to just chalk it up to the game designers trying to keep the pace and flowing and change things up, which is generous, I know. This part does get annoying on the higher difficulties, though, because you just end up burning through a lot of health items, trying to hold off an endless wave of enemies, while also trying to launch one of those Wrath of God sky missiles that give me the Vietnam flashbacks to Spec Ops: The Line. It's not my favorite section of the game, that's for sure, but it's short, and like I said, I'm enjoying what RE8 has to offer enough that I'm going to grant forgiveness. Besides, right after that, we're met with the final boss fight, which is one of the highlights of the game. I really love the final boss fight here. The boss has attacks and patterns that are unique, but once again show its influence by having a cycle of the boss that's reminiscent to Lord Sadler from RE4. But this boss fight is actually hard, unlike Lord Sadler. Greatest game ever made, especially on the higher difficulties. Completing this boss fight on the higher skills will require knowing the ins and outs of this boss's stages and movement patterns. Even with several health potions and a good amount of ammo, this fight will not fuck around on hardcore and up. Even on standard, if you rush through the game and you hit up the final boss low on supplies because you played it too fast and loose, you will have some work to do. This is a wonderful change of pace since Resident Evil 7 had a final boss fight that was absolute trash. So all in all, I'm very happy with Resident Evil Village so far, and I'm really looking forward to playing this thing again and again and again and again. Personally, if you're watching this and haven't picked up a copy of this game yet, I do highly recommend it. Such fun, much wow.
Later, Nick.